project on segregation with Bill Tinley. I have some questions I'm going to ask him about segregation. But before we get started, I'm going to do some personal questions. Mr. Bill, where were you born, where did you grow up, and what can you remember most about your childhood?
Thank you, Connor. I appreciate being here with you today. As far as the question of where I was born in East Los Angeles, in California. And my mother was an immigrant from Mexico, born though in Lordsburg, New Mexico. My father immigrated to Ellis Island in New York from Scotland when he was 10, 11 years old, and came out to California where they met and married, and I was their first child, born in East Los Angeles, which is well known for being a very Hispanic community and the home of Cheech and Chong.
Oh, cool. What do you remember most about your childhood?
Well, I was fortunate. We go back a long ways. We're talking, my childhood starts before World War II, all the way up to the 1950s, and it was a very good upbringing. My mother and father were home working. He as an engineer, my mother, at home taking care of four of us. Funny thing that I can remember is the community itself we lived in was a very, you might say, integrated back in those days. We had Hispanics, we had African Americans who had just recently come from the South and from the north of the United States out to California. We played a lot of sports, played a lot of baseball. And that period of time was just enjoyable. We learned a lot, we played together, very few problems during those first years of my life.
Okay, I got one more question for you. What is a moment from your life that you think people my age should hear about to help us become the best people we can be?
I think it starts when you're young, definitely, because life is tied to anything that's going to take place as far as values, as far as moral positions. I think start when you're young, and how you grow up will basically be responsible for how your life blossoms, you might say, or as you grow into it. I think that you start young, and it's also tied to family, like the South Pacific. Growing up in that movie, Once Upon a Time, that you got to grow up and think about other people from every walk of life, and I think that's very important because we live in a world that is so more and more integrated.
Okay, I got a question for you. Growing up, what do you remember being things that made people different? Like, for example, skin color, religion, gender, ethnicity, or all that other stuff. And at what point did you begin to recognize these differences? And were they important or unimportant to you? Why or why not?
Take into consideration the time I was growing up. It was very important because of the fact that the world was different than it is today. This has become a much more diverse world. But when I grew up, I had my brothers and sisters. We were quite different. We looked Hispanic, we looked Anglo. Within my family and within my relatives, in the 1940s, my aunt, who was Hispanic Mexican, married an African American and had to live out in Los Angeles, a little town called Cucamonga, and only people who were non-white could live there. So I used to go out there and visit with them. So I knew something about what you might call segregation early on. It's the same with my family. My father, who married my mother, was from Scotland. Because he came from Scotland, they had some reservations about my father marrying my mother. What happened? They eloped. They ran off and married. They did not marry in a church. They married in Santa Ana, California. The same thing happened with my brother, because he married a woman who was blonde, but she was American Indian, and for some reason their parents did not want them to marry, marry in a church, neither to marry. So they went off to Nigeria because my brother was in the Peace Corps. They married, you might say, eloped. And so I've always been aware of race, gender, all of these elements because it's been part of my life. We'll get in a while to talk about political things, things of that nature, but I think those are the things that really formed me.
My next one's going to be, do you remember any books, movies, signs, newspapers, anything like that that discuss racial issues or cultural stereotypes?
Yes, I read everything from To Kill a Mockingbird. I read James Baldwin when I was in my early formative years, which was in my late teens, early 20s. Throughout my life, I've been a passionate book reader, and I have read an awful lot about the civil rights. I've read a great deal about the conflicts that evolved, and they're not just coming out of the South, they're coming out of other parts of the world. As I told you earlier, Connor, I lived in other countries. I lived in South Africa during the time of apartheid. I lived in apartheid when whites and blacks could not, frankly, interact. My wife, I remember going to the post office in Johannesburg, South Africa. She went into the wrong door because it was the door for the black South African and not for the white South African. But she did not understand it because she had never been subjected to that type of treatment.
Oh, sorry. So what were they like, and how did you feel about it?
Well, the thing is, they were very polite, and they said, "You're in the wrong door. Go over to that door," and that's what my wife did. But going back to just in general, we've come a long ways from when I was a boy. Remember, I'm 77 years old, so the world has changed. But I grew up in a world where my father, for instance, was on a team in California. This is in California that was totally integrated, and I showed you that photo of him running and winning the championship with a mix of American Indians, African Americans, Hispanics, whites, and they all ran together. That was the world back then. After World War II, things started changing in California, and then, of course, my life changed because I joined the Peace Corps, went off to Africa, and spent 8 years in Africa. Also, many years later in Latin America and Europe. So I have a pretty good indication of what's going on in the world of segregation or false segregation, whatever you wish to call it. That's the people that you have had listed down there, like Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. Of course, we were involved because I was in Washington back in those days in the Foreign Service. We saw some of the, what unfolded with the demonstrations. We saw it in California. The riots in 1965 in Los Angeles took place on 77th Street. The riots had killed many people, many largely African Americans. We lived 1 block away from those riots on 77th Street. We lived on 76th Street. So we have a pretty good indication of what was, what was going on, and it's always been that way. My brother was always, who's passed away, was very much involved in the civil rights movement. I got more and more involved with the Hispanic when I became mayor of El Paso, when I was consul general in Ciudad Juarez. We were up to our eyeballs en las cosas mexicanas. But the thing is that these were largely Hispanic issues, and that's with Cesar Chavez, who used to come to El Paso, Texas, when we were there. Dolores Huerta, she was there. Martin Luther King we saw, of course, in Washington, D.C., when they held parades. I remember very well LBJ and the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the tremendous change that was going to evolve. It changed the mindset of many, but at the same time, it changed political directions of both the Democratic and Republican parties.
Did any types of legal segregation exist in your community?
Yes, it did. It's ironic, but out in California when I was growing up, there was a borderline called Alameda Avenue, which was in the dividing line largely between the white community, Hispanic community, and the African American community. It was unspoken, but that was in place. But it wasn't like segregation that existed in the South, which was quite different because the numbers were were not the same. But I saw many examples within the United States, Washington, D.C., when I was training with the Peace Corps. We had a Peace Corps group going to Ethiopia, the first group under Kennedy. When we were training, we went over to Glen Echo Park. Glen Echo Park was for exercises. We went there. After we worked out the Peace Corps volunteers, we went in to eat at a restaurant. We were told you cannot come into that restaurant because there was about 4 or 5 African Americans, Peace Corps volunteers, who were from California with me, and they were not allowed to enter. So we left. And that's just an example of, segregation that was still in effect at that time. It held true also in South Africa during my 3 years living there. Segregation. We talk about Nelson Mandela. We can talk about how today it's quite different. No longer is segregation a problem. No longer is apartheid, as they would call it, in place. But I've been subjected to that. My brother, my family. I've been very fortunate. You know why? Because, as you would say in Spanish, un güero. I've come out looking very blonde, and I've been able to get through everything in certain circles where a lot of people weren't. My brother I remember my brother went down to New Orleans, and he got chased down the streets of New Orleans by himself. So it's an interesting the concept of
do you have
segregation.
Any personal experience with segregation? How did you deal with it, and how did it affect you or the people around you?
Yes, we had a number of instances of segregation that affected us. I recall, as you can see, this photo I have here of my brother and my sister, who was also very dark-skinned, unlike my brother, who had kinky hair, wanted to marry someone, and she had a very difficult time getting the parents to go along with it. When I mean parents, I'm talking about her fiance's parents. My brother and I then decided that we would go ahead and serve as the wedding party because our father had died, and we were there to give away our daughter at the wedding. But it was a very, very difficult time for my daughter, not my daughter, but my sister, because of the nature of the attitudes of people around us who were not in a subtle way, they were practicing segregation, as far as I'm concerned. But this is a long
I
time
had
ago.
a wonderful time talking with you. I learned a whole lot of segregation. I'm pretty sure the students learned a lot about segregation as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Connor, for inviting me over. I enjoyed visiting with you, and I think this is a great project for your class, and hopefully it will get some wide coverage for you and your students. Thank you very much.